There was a clause in a settlement that no one had judged necessary to mention to her. There was a duke who could have written a plain letter and had chosen, for reasons that made sense, only at 3 in the morning, not to write one. And there was a woman who was, at that particular moment, folding table linens in the cold larder corner of a house that was not her own, with the quiet efficiency of a person who had already closed one account and was preparing to close another. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a bill from the linen draper, which was itself tucked inside a notice from her father's solicitor informing her that the latter, and therefore the former, no longer existed. That is to say, no father, no practice, no arrangement. The February of 1815 had settled over London like a woman who had made up her mind not to be moved. The gardens of Aldwych House, behind the great white townhouse on Bruton Street in Mayfair, began grey without conviction and ended grey with determination, the two shades of grey holding hands across a formal parterre that had not been trimmed since November. Philippa Carr was 24 years old. Her morning dress was the colour of lead. She wore no jewellery that could be sold. Her hair had been arranged before dawn by a housekeeper's second niece who had done her best, and a small terrier belonging to no one in particular had followed her from the servants' hall to the larder, and now sat on her left foot, as if that were a form of company on which she might rely. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening to this story from. The city, the hour, I read everyone. And if these stories of dukes and ladies make your heart breathe a little slower, leave a subscribe here. It is my quiet way of knowing that you have come back. This is a work of fiction set in Regency England. Characters, names, and situations are entirely imagined. Any resemblance to real persons or events is mere coincidence. She had been managing the supper arrangements for 20 minutes before she understood that managing the supper arrangements was the entirety of what anyone in the house intended for her that evening. Mrs. Holroyd, the housekeeper of Aldwych House, a tall, tidy woman with a professional smile trained into her cheeks like a cornerfold, had delivered this intelligence with the particular cheerfulness reserved for disappointing news given to persons presumed to have no recourse. The kitchen, she had said, were wonderfully organized. Miss Carr's presence downstairs had been a great comfort to the staff. The Dowager Duchess had mentioned in passing that it would be a shame to interrupt so useful an arrangement, which, translated from the language of housekeepers, meant, "The ballroom is not for you." Philippa had not answered. She had smoothed the fold of a linen napkin flat so that the crease ran clean from one embroidered corner to the other, and she had looked for a moment at her own hands, narrow, capable, ungloved for the work, and understood that this was how the evening would proceed. There was a ball upstairs, being given nominally in her father's memory, and practically in his absence. There was a supper laid for 112 people, and there was, in the left glove that lay across the deal table by her elbow, a letter from Mr. Grenfell of Aldwych and Grenfell, informing her, in the lateral manner of men who prefer their clients not to ask questions, that the Carr-Aldwych settlement of 1809 contained a provision she had not previously been made aware of. It concerned her. It concerned the Duke of Aldwych. It would require her presence, as if that were a thing one could schedule. The kitchen at Aldwych House was a long, low-ceilinged room built at the back of the ground floor, with a stone-flagged floor and a great black range against the north wall, and 3 tables of scrubbed oak arranged in a row down the middle. At the far end, past the range, was a door that let out into the kitchen garden. It was not the door for guests, it was the door for grocers, for coal, for the boy who came with the eggs. It faced the mews. On the other side of it, in the dark, was a paved yard, a boot scraper, a bay tree in a wooden tub, and 1 flight up an outside stair, the tall arched windows of the ballroom, which were, at this moment, lit from within with the particular yellow that only wax and mirrors together can make. You could hear the ball from the kitchen. You could hear it in the way a person on the shore hears the sea when the wind is right, as a distant, continuous sound in which now and then a single note, a single laugh, a single stringed note of Mr. Playford's orchestra would rise clean out of the general blur and be, for 1 second, the only sound in the world before it went under again. Philippa had learned in the 20 minutes of the supper arrangements to hear the ball without listening to it. It was in this posture, half turned to the deal table, napkin in her left hand, letter under the fingertips of her right, that she heard the door open. Not the door at the top of the servants' stair, which she had been half expecting for the last 10 minutes, because the head cook wanted an opinion on the ices. The other door, the garden side door, at the far end of the kitchen, behind the range. 10:30 was not the hour for guests. 10:30 was not, in fact, an hour at which any human being in evening dress had any business standing in the door of a kitchen from the garden side. And yet the man in the doorway was, she saw, in the 2 seconds that a person needs to see such things, in evening dress, black coat, white waistcoat, cravat tied by a valet who had opinions. He carried his hat in his left hand and a pair of gloves in his right, which told her he had come from the ballroom rather than toward it. Behind her, the kitchen staff forgot collectively how to do anything they were doing. A dish of chestnuts stopped being roasted. A sauce stopped being stirred. Mrs. Ainsworth, the head cook, a woman whose usual expression was that of a general who had lost patience with weather, dropped a wooden spoon into a copper pan and did not pick it up. Philippa set down the napkin before she looked up. She looked up. The Duke of Aldwych was, she had been given to understand by the London papers, 32 years old. He was tall. He was the sort of tall that in most rooms had to explain itself by ducking under lintels, and even now, in the doorway of a kitchen that had been built, admittedly, with sacks of flour rather than dukes in mind, he had come in at a slight forward stoop, as if the door had been a fact he had accounted for in advance. His hair was dark. His face, at this hour, was the face of a man who had made a decision on the stairs and was now, in the flesh, giving it its second look. He had not come to the kitchen by accident. "Miss Carr," said the Duke of Aldwych. "Your Grace," said Philippa. He glanced at the linens, at her hands, briefly at the faint bulge of the letter in her glove, which he could not possibly have identified for what it was, a letter folded twice, tucked into the wrist above her cuff, and which she was, nevertheless, in that instant, entirely certain he had identified for what it was. "I was told," he said, "you had been placed in the kitchens." "I was told," said Philippa, "that the kitchens required organizing." The smallest thing happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was closer to the expression of a man who had walked into a room prepared to find a problem, and had found instead a piece of it he had not been expecting. He glanced once at Mrs. Ainsworth, Mrs. Ainsworth, who had been in service in London for 28 years, and had not, in any of them, been looked at in her own kitchen by a duke in evening dress, executed a curtsy that was equal parts propriety and mechanical astonishment. "Mrs. Ainsworth," he said, "forgive the intrusion." "Your Grace," said Mrs. Ainsworth, which was all a woman was permitted to say to a duke standing in her kitchen at 10:30 in the evening on the night of his own ball. He turned back to Philippa. He held her gaze, not impolitely, but with the attention of a man reading a document he wasn't certain he understood. Then, with the smallest bow that could still be called a bow, "The first set is about to begin." She had perhaps 7 seconds to determine the correct answer. She spent 5 of them on the napkin. She spent the remaining 2 on his expression, which told her nothing useful, and was, therefore, more informative than it knew. There was a long consideration to be given to the question of what a woman in a lead-coloured morning dress ought to say to a duke who had come in through the garden door and had, without preface, informed her that the first set of the evening was about to begin. There was the impossibility of the dress, there was the impossibility of the letter. There was the impossibility of the fact that in some room upstairs, 112 people had been served a supper she had counted the plates for and would presently be led onto the parquet by an orchestra of 9 men in dark blue coats. There was the fact that no one inside that ballroom knew that she was in this house. And there was, in the middle of all of it, a very small fact that she noticed only because she was, by profession of upbringing, a solicitor's daughter, which was that the Duke of Aldwych had used her name. Not Miss Carr, of course, the vocative of politeness, but Miss Carr as if it were the name written on a document he had been carrying with him all evening. "Then," said Philippa Carr, "we had better not be late." She smoothed her glove flat over the letter. He inclined his head very slightly, the acknowledgement a chess player gives when he sees, from 3 moves out, the shape of the coming game, and stepped back from the doorway to leave her room to pass. She did not pass yet. There was, first, the matter of the dress. There was the matter of the shoes, which were serviceable house shoes and not evening slippers. There was the matter of the hair, which had been done at 7 that morning by a woman whose specialty was breakfast, not balls. There was the matter of the terrier who had raised his head at the sound of a strange voice and was, at this moment, sitting on her left foot with the air of a small dog who intended to accompany her upstairs on principle. She looked once at Mrs. Ainsworth. Mrs. Ainsworth, whose training in domestic emergency was second to none in the county of Middlesex, understood what was being asked of her before it had been asked. Mrs. Ainsworth did not smile. Mrs. Ainsworth was of the school that considered smiling in a kitchen to be a form of unsteadiness, but Mrs. Ainsworth reached to a hook beside the range and took down a shawl of soft grey wool, and with the neatness of a person who folded pastry, arranged it over Philippa Carr's shoulders in one gesture that was almost, but not quite, an embrace. The shawl covered the dress at the sleeves. It covered the sleeves at the wrist. It did not cover the letter, but the letter was hers, and she had by now decided that it would remain in her glove. "Well then, miss," said Mrs. Ainsworth quietly, "we shall keep the supper warm." Philippa moved the terrier off her foot with a nudge that was the closest she came that evening to a display of affection. She crossed the kitchen. The Duke of Aldwych, who was of the type of gentleman that opened doors as a matter of principle and not of gallantry, opened the door. They did not go up the outside stair. They went instead along the flagged passage past the still room and up the servants' stair, which was steep, and along the ground floor passage past the closed door of the library and the closed door of the small dining room, and up the great front stair, whose runner was turkey red, whose banister was mahogany, whose steps at the 3rd landing were worn along the outer edge by 70 years of feet. He walked on her right. He was the taller of the two by a full head. He held his hat in his left hand still, and he did not offer her his arm. Halfway up the great front stair, he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Philippa did not stop walking. "For which item, Your Grace?" He held her a beat before answering. "For the whole of it." She said nothing. She had not, she noticed, been offered a beat in which to say nothing since she was 17 years old, and had received her first proposal of marriage under circumstances that had not deserved the term. It was a strange feeling. This offered silence, and she used the 2 steps between the 2nd and 3rd landings to notice it and to fold it and to put it away. At the top of the stairs, the doors of the ballroom stood open. There is a way in which a room of 150 people, all of them dressed for the same event, and all of them speaking at once, will fall, in the second before the strings begin, into a shared, indrawn breath. There is a way in which every head that has been turned in one direction will now be turned in another, altogether, without command. She had not been at a ball since her father's death. She had not been before that at a ball of this size in her life. And yet the sound of the room, recognizing that the Duke of Aldwych had entered through the wrong door with the wrong woman on his arm, no, not on his arm, beside him, half a step behind him, in a lead-coloured morning dress and a grey wool shawl and a pair of house shoes, was a sound she recognized. It was the sound of a bill being presented. It was the sound of a debt being called in. Across the ballroom, on the opposite side, at the very centre of the far wall, between the two great mirrored panels which the Aldwych family had installed in 1791, at considerable expense, to double the apparent length of the room, the Dowager Duchess sat in a carved chair upholstered in cream silk. She was 73 years old. She wore black. She was in mourning, still, for her husband, dead these 11 years. And she had made of her mourning a form of political power. Her face, as she took in the doorway, did not move. Beside her, a step to her left on a stool of gilded wood, was a young woman of perhaps 22. She wore white gauze over pale rose silk. Her hair was fair. She was beautiful in the way of women whose beauty had been recognized as a family asset by the age of 6 and had been developed from that day forward with the discipline of a hothouse orchid. Her name, Philippa would learn within the hour, was Lady Serena Price, and she was the elder daughter of the Earl of Renwick, and she had been understood by the assembled fashionable of London for the whole of the previous season to be the woman whom the Duke of Aldwych would in due course marry. Lady Serena's face did not move either, which was, in its own way, informative. Mr. Playford, at the top of the orchestra, gave the sign to his violins. The first set of the evening, which was to be a country dance, arranged in 2 long lines the length of the ballroom, was about to begin. The Duke of Aldwych did not lead her to the top of the set. He stopped instead 3 paces inside the doorway. He turned. He looked once at the Dowager Duchess, a look that was not defiance and not apology and not, in any recognizable form, request. He looked once at Lady Serena Price. He looked then at Philippa Carr. "May I," he said in a voice pitched to carry to the wall behind her and no further, "have the honour of the first dance?" There was, in the ballroom of Aldwych House on the evening of the 21st of February in the year 1815, a silence of perhaps 3 seconds in which 149 people did the arithmetic that would occupy the drawing rooms of Mayfair for the following 6 weeks. Philippa Carr made 2 decisions in that silence. The first was that she would place her hand in his without looking at Lady Serena Price and without looking at the Dowager Duchess and without looking at anyone else in the room. The second was that when she did so, she would do it slowly, so that no person present could be permitted to believe that she had done it out of confusion. "You may, Your Grace," she said. He offered his hand, palm up. She removed the shawl, folded it once, and laid it over the arm of a small chair by the door, a movement made with 2 hands, deliberate, unhurried, the way a woman lays down a fan when she means to be gone from a room only briefly. Then she placed her ungloved right hand into his gloved left. The strings began. They danced. They danced because it was a country dance, and country dances at Aldwych House were danced in the old style, with the whole length of the room used for the figures, the 2 of them the length of the parquet, up and back, hands parted and hands rejoined, and every time she turned under his arm, she found that she had, without meaning to, developed a peripheral awareness of a young woman in white gauze on a gilded stool who had not, throughout the length of the first set, moved a single feature of her face. The Duke of Aldwych was, she registered, because she was a woman who by upbringing registered such things, a good dancer. He was not a showy dancer. He did not embellish the figures. He did what the figures required, cleanly, on the beat, and he did it with the expression of a man whose mind was almost entirely elsewhere. At the second turn, at the end of the room, when they stood facing one another between the 2 mirrored panels and had to wait 4 counts for the couple below them to complete their circle, he said, in a voice pitched below the strings, You have a letter in your glove." "I do," said Philippa. "May I ask from whom?" "Mr. Grenfell." He held her at that, not the hand he continued to hold. The gaze. He held her at the gaze in the manner of a man who had been about to hear one thing and had heard instead another that made better sense of what he had known all along. "When?" he said. "This morning." "Then you have not read it." "I have read it. All of it. To the second paragraph." He inhaled, one small breath through the nose, no more, and the couple below them completed their circle, and the strings arrived at the count on which he was to turn her under his arm. And he turned her, and the dance moved on, and the conversation, for the length of that dance, did not. At the end of the set he did not bow to her, he bowed instead to the room. It was a very small distinction. It was the distinction between a man who has completed a dance with a partner and a man who has completed a demonstration to an audience. He then bowed to her, separately, with the same measured minimum he had used at the kitchen door. And then he offered her his arm in the correct manner and led her through a corridor of stairs that had by now begun to sort themselves into camps, not to the refreshment tables and not to the Dowager Duchess, and not to the chair on which Lady Serena Price sat in her cloud of pale rose silk, but along the length of the ballroom, out through the great doors, across the marble landing, and down the front stair, and along the passage, and, very deliberately, into the library of Aldwych House, whose door he closed behind them. The library of Aldwych House was, at 11:30, on the evening of the 21st of February, in the year 1815, lit by 2 branches of wax candles on the mantel and by the low red glow of a coal fire in the grate. It was a long room, wainscoted to shoulder height in oak, with a bay window at the far end that gave onto the sunk garden, and it had a gallery running around 3 of its 4 walls, reached by 2 spiral stairs of black iron forged in 1762, from which the higher shelves could be read. In the middle of the room stood a long table of dark walnut, on which lay tonight a single object, a document of perhaps 12 pages, tied at the corner with tape of faded red, on top of which sat a small silver seal. The Duke of Aldwych did not sit. He did not offer her a chair. He crossed to the table, laid his hat and gloves upon it, and turned to face her from the opposite side of that table, which put the width of the walnut between them, and incidentally put Philippa Carr in the position of looking across the very document that the whole of the evening had been about. The letter in her glove weighed, at this moment, a great deal more than it had weighed at the kitchen door. "Miss Carr," said the Duke of Aldwych, "I understand that we have not been properly introduced." "We have not," said Philippa. "I am Adrian Fairholme, the 5th Duke of Aldwych. I inherited the title 6 years ago, in the autumn of 1809. My father was Henry Fairholme, the 4th Duke, who died on the 17th of October of that year. He had been unwell for the better part of a decade. I'm told by those who knew him best that he was, in the last 2 years of his life, not always in a state of clarity." He waited. Philippa said nothing. He had, she registered, told her 3 things in 3 sentences, each of which she was to hold and to weigh, and none of which he had troubled to underline. "I have," he continued, "come this evening from the ballroom to the kitchen to fetch you because I was informed at 10 o'clock by my aunt that a Miss Philippa Carr had been placed in the servants' hall on the grounds that no one had been quite certain what else to do with her. I was informed at 10:10 by Mrs. Holroyd that she had been offered the choice of remaining upstairs as a guest, and had declined and had asked to be given something useful to do." He held her at that. "I have," he said, "some difficulty believing the second." "Mrs. Holroyd," said Philippa quietly, "is very good at her position." "She is. She understands that certain choices, if not offered, cannot be refused." He did not answer that at once. He looked briefly at the document on the table and then back at her, and she had the sudden, uncomfortable sense of a man doing arithmetic in his head and reaching a total he did not care for. "Miss Carr," he said, "would you sit?" "I would rather stand, Your Grace." "So would I." He put his hands then on the back of the chair that was placed at his end of the table, a chair he did not intend to use, and he looked at her across the width of walnut with the expression of a man who had ensured that he had, between himself and the woman he was addressing, an object of a specific size, and who was not certain, still, whether the object was there for his protection or for hers. "There was," he said, "a settlement drawn up in the summer of 1809 between your father and mine. Its ostensible purpose was the resolution of a matter of professional retainer. My father had for some time employed your father as his London solicitor in matters concerning the Aldwych estates, and there was owed a considerable sum of fees which had, through my father's illness, gone unregulated. The settlement paid those fees. It also, in a manner which I did not until this morning fully understand, made further provision." Philippa said nothing. "That further provision," said the Duke of Aldwych, "concerned you." "Yes," said Philippa. He held her then at that yes. She knew because she was a solicitor's daughter and had grown up under the eye of a man who had believed that the interior life of a client was to be read in the way she said the words the settlement required her to say, that the yes had told him something. It had told him that she knew. Not what, not yet, but that. "Would you tell me," he said, "what Mr. Grenfell wrote?" "He wrote," said Philippa, "that the settlement of 1809 contained a clause not previously drawn to my attention, that the clause concerned me, that it concerned your Grace, that it would require my presence. And that was all he wrote in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, he wrote that he begged me to open the letter only in a room in which I could be alone. As I have not, since 9:30 this morning, been in a room in which I could be alone, I have not opened the second paragraph." The Duke of Aldwych considered the coal fire in the grate. Then he considered very briefly, so briefly, that only a woman who had been waiting for it would have seen it. The door. "Miss Carr," he said, "would you do me the very great favor of opening the letter now?" "In your presence, Your Grace." "In my presence." Philippa Carr, who had been trained by her father in the following 4 propositions: that a document is never opened for the first time in the presence of a person to whom its contents are already known, that a document to which one is a party is never opened for the first time in the presence of a person to whom one is not yet a party, that a document is never opened in a house in which one is not free to leave, and that a document is never opened in one's own hand. If that hand is shaking until the hand has ceased to shake, did 4 things very quickly and in the following order. She unbuttoned her right glove at the wrist. She drew the letter from the glove. She placed the letter on the table between herself and the Duke of Aldwych, so that either or neither of them could read it. And she said, without lifting her hand from the letter, "I would ask, first, that you tell me what it says." He held her at that. Then, with the very small correction at the corner of his mouth that she had first seen in the kitchen, he inclined his head and he told her. "The clause in the settlement of 1809, drawn up in the July of that year between Henry Fairholme, 4th Duke of Aldwych, and George Carr of Norfolk Street solicitor, provided as follows. In the event that the said George Carr should predecease his daughter, Philippa Ann Carr, and that the said Philippa Ann Carr should on the day of her father's death be unmarried and without independent maintenance, the estate of Aldwych would undertake, jointly and severally, 3 obligations. The first and least of these was the payment of an annuity of £147 11 shillings per annum to be paid quarterly from the rents of the North Farms of Aldwych Park in Hertfordshire, and to continue during her natural life. The second and greater was the settlement upon her at her sole disposition of the small dower house on the western edge of Aldwych Park, a house of 8 rooms with garden, orchard, and the use of 1 gig and 1 horse from the home stables. The third and most peculiar was that these 2 provisions were to be understood not as charity, but as the discharge of a debt of honour, and were to be paid whether or not she consented to them, whether or not she requested them, and whether or not she came to Aldwych House at all. "You are," said the Duke of Aldwych, "an heiress." "I am not," said Philippa. "You are an heiress of £147 a year and a house of 8 rooms, which is more than a very great number of women of my acquaintance have to begin the day with." "That is not," said Philippa, "the same thing." "No," he said, "it is not." He stood still, with his hands on the back of the chair. He had not moved during the recital. His face, which she was beginning, without wanting to be able to read, showed nothing beyond the expression of a man who had, for 6 years, been under a certain impression as to the shape of a certain document, and who was now revising that impression, and who was doing so with the caution of a man who did not trust the revision. "There is," said Philippa, "a 4th provision." The Duke of Aldwych looked then at her, and not at the letter. "Yes," he said quietly, "there is." "You know what it is." "I do." "Your Grace," said Philippa, "I would ask that you tell me." He did not, for a very long moment, tell her. Instead, he did the thing that Philippa Carr, who had spent 8 years of her life in the drawing-rooms of men who used silence as a weapon, and 8 more in the office of a solicitor who used it as a form of surgery, was not prepared for. He looked once at the coal fire in the grate. He said quietly, "The 4th provision was that in the event of my father's death, and of your father's death, and of my inheritance of the title, the estate of Aldwych would offer you, in addition to the annuity and the house, the option of marriage to the incumbent duke, to be exercised or declined at your discretion, and to remain open for a period of 10 years from the death of the second of the 2 men. He did not soften it. He did not phrase it as a gallantry. He did not lift his eyes from the fire until the last word was out. He said it, in fact, as a solicitor would have said it, and in doing so paid her father, without meaning to, a compliment which she was only later to understand. The clock on the mantel of the library of Aldwych House struck the 12:15. 10 years, said Philippa Carr. 10 years. From October of 1809. From October of 1809. Which leaves? Which leaves, said the Duke of Aldwych, 4 years, 7 months, and some days. Some days. Some days. There was then a silence in the library, in which the 2 great clocks that the 4th Duke had bought in Vienna in the year 1793, one on the mantel and one at the far end of the room above the door, went slightly out of time with one another, so that the small ticks stopped stacking and began instead to slide past each other in the way of 2 footfalls in a corridor. Philippa laid her hand flat over the letter on the table. The paper was warm from the glove and cold at the edges where the air had reached it. She thought very briefly, in the way a woman thinks a thing she does not intend to say, of the terrier on her left foot in the kitchen, and of the shawl that Mrs. Ainsworth had folded over her shoulders, and of the letter that lay under her hand, which had turned, in the space of an hour, from a fact she could carry into a fact she could not. "Your Grace," she said, "may I ask you a question?" "Yes." "Did you know of this clause before this morning?" He held her at that. "Miss Carr," he said, "I did not." "Your Grace." "I did not." "You are a duke," said Philippa. "The settlements of the estate would have been read to you at your inheritance." "They were read to me." "By whom?" "By Mr. Grenfell's father, who was, at the time, the senior partner of the firm. And this clause was not read. It was not. Your Grace, forgive me. I'm the daughter of a solicitor. I know, as a matter of professional fact, that no clause in a settlement of that kind is left unread at the inheritance of the party principally bound by it. You are correct. Then how? He looked at last up from the fire. Miss Carr, he said, I do not know. And there was, in the way he said it, the small crack of a man who, she saw, with a clarity that she was not prepared for, had spent the day between the receipt of the letter that morning and his arrival in the kitchen at 10:30, considering the same question that had been put to him, and reaching, on the several routes he had tried, the same reply. Philippa Carr, who had been, when the evening began, a woman in a lead-colored dress folding table linens in the cold larder corner of a house that was not her own, folded the letter once on the walnut table. She placed her ungloved hand upon it. She looked at the Duke of Aldwych from the opposite side of the object he had insisted on placing between them, and she said quietly, "Then we are, both of us, in the same position of not knowing." "We are, Your Grace." "Miss Carr." "I shall not tonight," said Philippa Carr, "give you an answer." "I did not tonight," said the Duke of Aldwych, "ask for one." Then, he said, "there is upstairs a ball which is about to run out of second sets, and a supper which is about to run out of patience. I shall return to the ballroom. You will be shown by Mrs. Holroyd, who will have in the interval understood her error, to the room that has in fact been made ready for you on the second floor. In the morning, if you will permit it, I shall speak with Mr. Grenfell. In the afternoon, if you will permit it, I shall speak with you." "Your Grace." "You will not," said the Duke of Aldwych evenly, "be returned to the kitchens." "I was not," said Philippa, "in the kitchens against my will. I asked to be there. I did not know how to be anywhere else in this house tonight." He held her at that. Then, quite quietly, in a voice pitched neither for the room nor for the door, "I understand." He picked up his hat. He picked up his gloves. He did not open the letter. He did not touch the settlement on the table. He crossed the library from his side of the walnut to hers, and he stopped a full step short of her, and he inclined his head, a bow the depth of which she was at the moment in no state to measure, and he said so quietly that she almost did not hear it, "Miss Carr, I am sorry." He crossed to the door. He turned at the door. He held the handle for a full second before he opened it. "For which item, Your Grace?" said Philippa Carr, who had discovered in the course of 1 hour that she was a woman who had lines of dialogue to which she could not, after the fact, quite account. "For the whole of it," said the Duke of Aldwych. He opened the door. He closed the door. She stood for a very long time, alone in the library of Aldwych House, with a letter on a walnut table and 2 clocks not quite in time, and understood, with the composure of a woman who had already, several hours earlier, closed a different account, that the account was not going to close after all. The house they had put her in was a house of many corridors, and it took Mrs. Holroyd, whose professional smile had been, in the interval, replaced by an expression of professional apology that was slightly more difficult to bear than the smile had been, the better part of 10 minutes to walk her from the door of the library to a room on the second floor that had been, all along, made ready for a Miss Carr who had, all along, been expected. The room was not grand. It was a small chamber toward the back of the house, above the kitchen garden, with one long window whose shutters had not been closed, a bed of good painted wood with hangings of faded blue, a writing table, a chair, a candle in a plain brass stick, and on the small table by the bed, a glass of water, a copy of Cowper's poems in a soft leather binding, and a folded piece of paper. Philippa recognized her own handwriting on the folded piece of paper before she recognized what it was. It was the note she had written that morning, before the letter had arrived, to be given to Mrs. Holroyd on her arrival at Aldwych House. A note that said, in 3 lines, that she had come at the request of Mr. Grenfell, that she wished only to know where she might be useful, and that she thanked the household in advance for the very great kindness of its trouble. The note had, on the reverse, an addition in a hand not her own. It read, "Miss Carr, I have taken the liberty of assigning you this room. I regret the manner of the day. Mrs. Holroyd will explain nothing, because I have instructed her to say nothing. I shall explain in the morning. A.F." She sat down on the edge of the bed. She unfolded the letter from her glove, laid it on the writing table, and did not, for a full minute, look at it. She looked instead at the shutters, which had not been closed, and at the piece of the winter garden beyond them, over which a moon of pale, ordinary competence had risen at some point during the ball. She thought of her father. She thought of the office on Norfolk Street. She thought of the small deal desk at which she had, from the age of 13 to the age of 22, sat opposite her father, while he explained to her the shape of a settlement, of a codicil, of a promise of marriage that had been made in law and needed to be unmade in law, of a debt of honor and how it differed from a debt of coin. "Do not sign, Pip," her father had said to her, more times than she could count, "until you know why the paper was drawn." She had that morning thought she knew. She rose, she crossed to the writing table. She sat, she opened the letter to the second paragraph. The second paragraph read, "Miss Carr, if you have not by now been informed of the substance of the clause by the party principally concerned, that is, by His Grace the Duke of Aldwych, I beg you to withhold judgment on both of us until you have been. There has been a considerable irregularity in the way this document has been kept, and the responsibility for that irregularity rests, in the first instance, with this firm. Your father instructed us in 1809 that this clause was to be brought to your attention on your 21st birthday, in the event that he was no longer living. He was, at the time we drew it, in a very poor state of health, and there is no doubt in my mind that he intended you to know of it. That we did not inform you at your majority is a failing of my father's, whose duty this was. That we did not inform you at his death 6 months ago is a failing of mine. I beg your pardon for both. I remain your very humble servant, Michael Grenfell." Philippa Carr sat for a very long time with her hand flat on the second paragraph of Mr. Grenfell's letter. She thought, in the flat, unornamented way of a woman who had been trained to think it, that her father, who had died in September, had known for 6 years that a duke had signed a paper offering to marry his daughter, and had kept the paper in the drawer of his desk, and had died without telling her. She thought, because the thought would not be kept out, that this was the sort of thing a father did only if he had believed, from the beginning, that the daughter would not need it, that he had believed, for 6 years, that his practice would go on, that his health would go on, that the arrangement he had made for her would remain the arrangement he had made for her, and that the paper in the drawer was a thing to be shown to her, at his own hand, at the right time. She thought, because at some point in a night like this, a woman thinks the things she does not want to think, that the right time had come and gone without him. She folded the letter, she put out the candle. She did not lie down. She sat in the chair by the writing table, with her hand on the letter and her eyes on the shutters that had not been closed, and she watched the ordinary moon over the winter garden move, in the way of ordinary moons, 3 inches to the right of where she had first seen it. There was a way in which the following morning was ordinary, and a way in which it was not. The ordinary way was that Aldwych House at 10 o'clock in the morning of the 22nd of February in the year 1815 ran on the same rails on which it had run at 10 o'clock on the 21st. Fires laid, curtains opened, coffee brought upstairs on a tray, a housemaid in the passage with a broom, a footman in the hall with a note, the Dowager Duchess in the small dining room reading the Morning Post as she did every day of her life. The not ordinary way was that when Mrs. Holroyd came at 9:30 to inquire whether Miss Carr would come down to breakfast. The professional smile, which had been trained into her cheeks like a corner fold, was, that morning, held in place by an effort that was audible in her voice. Philippa said that she would come down. She had, in the trunk in her room, one other dress. It was the colour of a paler lead. She wore it. She had in her hair no ornament that could be sold. She wore none. She descended the great front stair with the terrier who had in the night followed her upstairs by a route she did not entirely trace, 3 steps behind her. At the door of the small dining room, Mrs. Holroyd, whose apology of the previous evening had, overnight, been folded and put away like her smile, informed Philippa in a low voice that Her Grace the Dowager Duchess had asked to see her at 11 in the yellow drawing room. Would Miss Carr take breakfast in the small dining room in the interval? Philippa said that she would. The Duke of Aldwych was not at breakfast. Lady Serena Price was not at breakfast. 2 elderly cousins, whose names Philippa did not know, and who did not in the end tell her, were at breakfast. They asked her twice whether she had slept well. They did not ask her anything else. The elder of the 2, a Mrs. Pettifer in a lace cap, did remark, without looking up from her toast, that she had greatly enjoyed the first set of the previous evening, and that country dances were now so seldom danced in the old style, and that it was a pleasure to see a young couple who understood the figures without embellishing them. She said this to her plate. She then said, still to her plate, that some persons of her acquaintance found the old style tedious, and that it was a great mistake to allow the modern style to dictate. Philippa ate her toast. She drank her tea. She said at the appropriate points that she had slept well, that country dances in the old style were a great pleasure, and that Mrs. Pettifer was very kind to inquire. At 11, Mrs. Holroyd, professionally opaque, professionally correct, showed her into the yellow drawing room. The yellow drawing room of Aldwych House was called the yellow drawing room for the colour of its walls, which had been painted in 1788 in a shade of pale primrose that had, over the intervening 27 years, been quietly repainted in a shade that was almost, but not exactly, the same. It was a room of about 30 feet by 20, with a fire lit at the north end and a window that gave onto Bruton Street at the south. It had 2 settees, 4 chairs, a low table with a bowl of hothouse anemones, and at the north end, in a low chair before the fire, the Dowager Duchess. She was that morning in grey. She had put off, for the first time in the 11 years of her mourning, the black in which the room had come to expect her. She had not, however, put off the mourning. She had merely, Philippa understood at once, changed its language. "Miss Carr," said the Dowager Duchess. "Your Grace," said Philippa, "would you sit?" Philippa sat at the settee opposite, at the appropriate distance and no closer. The Dowager Duchess held her as her nephew held people, Philippa noticed, but without the softening at the corner of the mouth that in the nephew implied that the reading had not yet concluded. In the Dowager Duchess it had concluded. It had in fact concluded before Philippa had entered the room. "Your father," said the Dowager Duchess, "was a good man." "He was, Your Grace. My husband, the 4th Duke, thought very highly of him. He was kind enough to say so when the occasion permitted. Miss Carr, my nephew told me this morning of a certain provision in a certain settlement. He did not, when I ask my opinion. He did, when I did not ask, offer it. I therefore know what I know, and you know what you know, and there is no need for either of us to pretend to less." "Yes, Your Grace." The Dowager Duchess looked briefly at the anemones. Then she looked back. "There is," she said, "a young woman whose family have understood, for the whole of the past season, that my nephew would in due course propose. That understanding was, in strict terms, offered by no one in this house. In looser terms, it was allowed. I allowed it. I regret this morning having allowed it. That is a private matter which does not concern you." What concerns you is that the young woman in question is in this house at this moment, that she was in this house last night, that she was in this room 10 minutes before you were shown in, and that she asked me in her own way what my intention now is. Yes, Your Grace. I told her, said the Dowager Duchess, that my intention was to become acquainted with Miss Carr. Philippa lowered her eyes for 1 second. When she raised them, she said, "That is very kind, Your Grace." "It is not kindness, Miss Carr. It is the discharge of an obligation, of which, until my nephew informed me this morning, I had not been made aware. I do not care for the position in which I've been placed. I do not blame you for it. I do not at this moment blame anyone for it. I wish only to say that if you find, in the course of the next several days, that you have not been treated with the correctness you have every right to expect in this house, you will inform me, and the fault will be corrected by me personally. Yes, Your Grace. That is the whole of what I intended to say to you." "Then I shall thank you and rise." "Sit for another moment. There is a further thing. It is not from me, it is from myself as your senior in years, and as you will forgive me, a woman who has read a great many settlements in her own hand. The clause is not a proposal, it is an option. My nephew, of whom I know a great deal that you do not know, and of whom you know at this moment 1 or 2 things that I do not, has been offered 6 years ago in his father's hand an obligation. He has not, at any point in the 6 years, considered himself absolved of it. I am telling you this because I wish you to understand, before he tells you himself, that the obligation is not being discovered by him this morning. It is being disclosed to you. There is a difference, Miss Carr, in law and out of it." "Yes, Your Grace." "You have," said the Dowager Duchess, "your father's steadiness." "Thank you, Your Grace. I did not intend it entirely as a compliment. Now go." Philippa rose. She curtsied. She withdrew. The terrier, who had waited outside the yellow drawing-room with the patience of a small dog, who understood that his opinion had not been solicited, fell in at her heel. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Duke of Aldwych sent a note requesting the honour of Miss Carr's company in the library. He was already there when she arrived. He rose. He did not this time place the walnut table between them. He gestured instead to 2 chairs drawn up before the fire. He waited until she had sat. He then sat across a small tea table on which had been placed a decanter, 2 glasses, a plate of thin biscuits, and very deliberately, so that she might see he had brought nothing else, his own hands folded on the table. "Miss Carr," he said, "I have been to see Mr. Grenfell this morning. He has expressed his regret to me in the same terms in which he has expressed it to you. He will call at Aldwych House on Wednesday if you will receive him, and will bring the original of the settlement of 1809, from which you may satisfy yourself as to the terms in your father's hand and mine." "In your father's hand and yours." "My father signed for the Aldwych estate. I signed as heir, with my father's guardianship. I was, at the time, 26. Yes. I was, at the time, in Vienna, which I mention only to explain that I was not present in the room in which the settlement was drawn. My father dictated the clauses. Your father drew them. My father signed. He then sent the document to me by post. I signed and returned it. I understood the first 3 provisions. I did not then understand the 4th. You did not read it. I read it. I did not at the time understand for what it was. Your Grace, I was 26. My father had been unwell for a long time. He had, in the last 2 years, developed a habit of making arrangements that were not always intelligible to the members of his household at the time, and were, some of them, very intelligible in retrospect. I took the clause to be the intention of a man who wished, in some private way of his own, to acknowledge a debt to a friend. I did not take it to be the intention of a man who wished to bind me. I signed it because he asked me to sign it, and because I had, at the time, no reason to refuse. You did not know me. I did not know you. He had at some point in the summer of 1808 met you once, in your father's parlour in Norfolk Street. You were at the time 17. He did not tell me he had met you. Mr. Grenfell told me this morning. He came once to Norfolk Street, said Philippa slowly, in September of 1808. My father called for tea. I brought it. Yes. I did not know he was a duke. My father said only that he was a client. He would not have wished you to know. Why? The Duke of Aldwych looked briefly at the fire. Miss Carr, he said, I do not know. Your Grace. Yesterday, in this room at 11:30, you said the same thing to a different question. I begin to be uncertain when you say it, whether it is because you do not know or because you have decided not to say. He held her at that. Both, he said at last. In part. I do not know all of what my father intended. I have my own opinion. I have not, this morning, been willing to press it upon you as knowledge when it is only guess. May I have the guess, Your Grace? He held her again. Yes, he said quietly. He poured then 2 glasses of the wine on the table, a Madeira of the colour of dark amber, which she had not seen since the last time it had been served in her father's small dining room in Norfolk Street. And he handed her one, and he took the other, and he set it down before him without drinking from it. I believe, he said, that my father in the summer of 1809, when he drew this settlement with yours, was aware that his own son had not yet learned how to be told no, that he had a title he had not yet inherited, and that he would inherit it into a world in which very few persons would be in a position to refuse him. That he wished, for reasons which were entirely his own, and which have to do with the man he had once been rather than the man he had become, to leave in the world one door which would remain closed against his son at his son's discretion, and which his son would have to knock at in his own time if he wished it open. Philippa Carr was silent for a very long time. Then, quietly, Your father was a philosopher. My father was a man, said the Duke of Aldwych, who had, in the last 2 years of his life, arrived at a great many opinions of the kind that are not intelligible to a household at the time, and to a son who had not yet learned how to be told no. To that son also at the time, that son has learned since. Has he? He held her at that without answering. Miss Carr, he said quietly, I'm asking you nothing today. I would like, if you will permit it, to know you a little. I would like in return, if you will permit it, to be known by you a little. I would like, at the end of the term, the clause allows, that is, in the autumn of 1819, to have the acquaintance to be able to speak to you, whether the answer you are then to give is yes or no, as a person who has some right to have asked the question. That is 4 years, Your Grace. It is. During which, he said, I shall consider myself the servant of the intention my father recorded, which was that you would be given every advantage of situation, of independence, and of choice. And the young woman in white gauze will not be proposed to by me at this time. At this time, Miss Carr, I will not tell you an untruth to make you comfortable. Lady Serena Price has been for some months of the previous season a very frequent presence in this house. I have not. I will not have proposed marriage to her before I have discharged the obligation I owe to you. I shall not now propose it while the obligation is open. Whether at the end of 4 years I shall or shall not is not a thing I am prepared to answer, because it is not, this afternoon, an answer I possess. That is not, said Philippa quietly, a comfortable answer. No, but it is a true one. Yes. She looked then at the Madeira in her hand. She looked then at the fire. She thought with the composure of a woman who had spent the night sitting in a chair by a window that had not been shuttered, of her father and of the man he had called for tea in the small parlour in Norfolk Street in September of 1808, and of what it must have taken for a solicitor of no great fortune to write into the settlement of a great estate the clause that made the daughter of the solicitor free, and how it must have taken, in the writing, a very careful phrasing and a very careful placement, and how it must have been, at the time, understood between the two men to be the sort of clause that would either be found by the son on his own, or would come to light in due course, in the way that such things did. "Your Grace," she said at last, "yes. I shall accept the house." He held her at that. "I shall accept the annuity." "Yes." "I shall not this afternoon accept or decline the fourth provision." "No. I shall consider it, and I shall consider it in the House, and I shall consider it at Aldwych Park, and I shall consider it in whatever place I find that I am able to consider it. I shall not consider it here in Bruton Street. I do not intend disrespect to your house. I only mean that I cannot think in a room in which the second person in a decision is the person to whom the decision applies. That is fair. You will not in the interval presume upon it." "I will not." "You will not in the interval propose it in another form." "I will not." "You will not in the interval propose it to another." He held her. "I will not," he said quietly, "propose it to another." "Then I shall go to Aldwych Park," said Philippa Carr, "on the first day of March, and I shall write from Aldwych Park whenever there is a thing to write, or when there is a question that requires answering, and I shall receive letters from you at Aldwych Park whenever there is a thing to write, or when there is a question that requires answering. And in the autumn of 1819, when the term expires, I shall be, whichever answer I then give, in a position to give it." Miss Carr: "Your Grace, thank you. Your Grace, there is a further thing." He inclined his head. "You will not," said Philippa Carr, "come to the kitchen door again." He held her at that for a long moment. "No," he said quietly, "I shall not." "I do not," she added, more quietly still, "mean that I did not wish you to. I mean that a house in which a duke opens a door of a kitchen is a house in which someone will be blamed for its being opened, and I shall not have Mrs. Ainsworth blamed for a thing that she did not do." He smiled, then the first smile she had seen from him, and it was not at all the correction at the corner of the mouth, but a small, full smile of a man who has recognized briefly a thing he was not looking for. "Miss Carr," he said, "Mrs. Ainsworth is a woman of a great many years' service. She will not be blamed. I shall not have her at risk of it." "No." "Then good afternoon, Your Grace." "Miss Carr." She rose. He rose. He did not offer her his arm. He walked her in silence along the passage to the door of the yellow drawing-room in which the Dowager Duchess still sat, in grey, before a fire that had been mended once in the interval. He inclined his head to his aunt. His aunt inclined hers to him. He walked then back to the library. Philippa Carr walked alone to the small chamber above the kitchen garden and closed the door, and sat once more in the chair by the writing table. The clock on the mantel struck 4. She wrote in her own hand, on a sheet of the writing paper she had found in the drawer, the following: "To Michael Grenfell, Esquire. Sir, I have this day accepted the annuity of £147 and 11 shillings per annum, and the house of 8 rooms on the western edge of Aldwych Park, to which the settlement of 1809 entitles me. I have declined for the present to give an answer to the fourth provision. I would ask that you inform me, in writing, of the earliest date on which I may take possession of the house, and of the arrangements that will be necessary for its maintenance. I remain, sir, your very obliged servant, Philippa Carr." She sealed it. She rang. The footman who came was named William. He was 17. He was very careful with the seal. The house at Aldwych Park, to which the settlement of 1809 entitled her, was a small stone house of the last century. built in the pale grey stone of the country to the northwest of London, with a tiled roof of red that had gone to soft brown at the corners, a garden of about half an acre inside a wall of grey stone, an orchard of 6 trees at the back, and a small stable for the gig and the horse behind the orchard. It had been, for the last 11 years, the residence of a very old cousin of the 4th Duke, who had died in it in November. It had been aired and replastered in December. It had been repapered in January. It had, in short, been waiting. Philippa Carr took possession of it on the 1st of March. She took possession of it alone, in the sense that no member of the Aldwych household came with her, and not alone in the sense that Mrs. Ainsworth had, on the last morning at Bruton Street, provided her with the second cook's youngest sister, a young woman of 19 named Betsy Fleet, whose mother had died in the previous spring as a maid, and that the terrier had, as she had understood he would, come with her without asking. She unpacked her one trunk. She hung her 3 dresses in the press. She placed on the writing table in the small drawing room, whose window gave onto the orchard, the copy of Cowper's poems, which had been in the room at Bruton Street. She placed beside it the letter from Mr. Grenfell, which she had opened, at last, in a room in which she could be alone. She did not, in the first week, write to the Duke of Aldwych. She wrote in the first week to Mr. Grenfell twice, on matters of the maintenance of the house. She wrote to Mrs. Ainsworth once, in thanks for Betsy. She wrote to no one else. In the second week, on the Wednesday, a letter came from Bruton Street. It was in a hand she recognized, without ever having seen it, as the hand of the Duke of Aldwych, a hand of medium size, upright, the loops of the L's and the H's small and close to the stem, the crosses of the T's placed exactly at the crossing and not a hair to the right. The letter was short. It said, "Miss Carr, I write only to say that the north lot has been let to a new tenant for the term of 7 years, at a rent which is, I am informed by the steward, above the market. He is a Mr. Alan Wicks of Watford, whom you will not know and have no need to know, but whom I mention because a portion of the rent, the portion which the settlement assigns, will be paid to you quarterly beginning at Lady Day. I have instructed the steward to pay the first quarter direct. I remain your very humble servant, A.F." Philippa read the letter. She placed it, folded in the drawer of the writing table. She wrote in reply the following: "Your Grace, I thank you for the intelligence regarding the north lot. I am, sir, your very obliged servant, P.C." She sent it. She thought, briefly, that she had said too little. She thought, briefly, that she had said exactly enough. She did not, in the end, send a second letter. In the 3rd week, on the Friday, a second letter came. It said, "Miss Carr, there is, in the library at Aldwych Park, a book of poems by Mr. Cowper, which I borrowed from your father in the winter of 1808, and did not, at his death, return. I have this morning discovered it. I shall not send it by the post. I shall bring it, if you will permit, on the 22nd of March, at 3 in the afternoon. I remain your very humble servant, A.F." She read the letter 3 times. She replied, "Your Grace, I shall receive the book on the 22nd of March at 3 in the afternoon. I am, sir, your very obliged servant, P.C." He came on the 22nd of March at 3. He came on horseback. He came alone. He wore riding dress. He rode to the small gate at the back of the garden, tied his horse to a ring on the wall, and knocked at the kitchen door, which was, at the little house, the only door that was not the front door, and would not enter the drawing-room until he had asked Betsy Fleet whether her mother had left the family a debt at the chandler's in the village, and had established that she had not, and had established that Betsy's brother, who was 15, was learning the trade of a joiner in the village. Betsy said afterward that His Grace was the most civil man she had ever seen, and that she did not know how she was to survive an afternoon in which he sat in the same room as her mistress and drank tea, and she did survive it, and the tea was good. He sat in the small drawing room in the chair opposite Philippa. He did not, at any point in the 70 minutes for which he sat there, place a table between them. He did not, at any point, refer to the letter of the 21st of February, or to the yellow drawing room, or to the Dowager Duchess, or to Lady Serena Price. He referred instead to the book. The book was a small green leather duodecimo of Cowper's poems of 1802, with the initials G.C. embossed on the front cover in gold gilt gone dull. He had wrapped it in a piece of soft grey paper. He placed it on the table between them. He said only, "It has been at Bruton Street, in a shelf of my father's, since the winter of 1808. I had not looked for it there. Your father lent it to my father, in fact, and not to me. But it will come to you either way." She untied the paper. She opened the book, her father's hand on the flyleaf, G. Carr, Norfolk Street, London, 1804, his hand on the third page in pencil at the head of The Task, read to P. This evening, she likes the beginning better than the end. She held the book for a long moment at the third page, then without looking up, "Your Grace, it is very kind of you to have come." "Miss Carr," he said quietly, "it was not kindness." "No," she said, "I know." They spoke then of other things, of the north lot and its new tenant, of the roof of the small stable which had been mended in the interval, of Betsy's brother's joinery, of the orchard which had 6 trees, of which 4 were apples of a kind he did not recognize, and 1 was a plum, and 1 was a pear, of the weather, of the roads, of the small library that had been in the house of the very old cousin who had died in November, which the Duke of Aldwych had given orders should be left in the house for its next occupant, and of which Philippa Carr had, in the fortnight since her arrival, read the 7 books that most interested her. At 4:30 he rose. He inclined his head. He said at the door of the drawing-room, "May I come again?" "Yes, Your Grace." "When?" "When there is a thing to bring." He held her then at that. The correction at the corner of his mouth appeared, and did not this time entirely disappear. "There will be something," he said. He rode away, alone, on the road back to London. The spring came in that year at Aldwych Park, in the way of English springs. Not all at once, and not fairly. There was a warm week in the middle of April, in which the plum tree in the orchard put out its blossom in a rush of white. There was a cold week at the end of the month, in which the blossom was thrown into the grass by a wind out of the north, and in which Philippa, in a shawl, walked in the wet grass with the terrier, and picked up the fallen petals in her hand, and could not, in the end, quite explain to herself why. There was a very warm morning at the beginning of May, in which the small greenhouse at the far end of the garden, a house of 8 small panels of glass, whose iron frame had been painted white in 1799 and had not since been painted anything at all, was found by Betsy Fleet to have retained in the night a temperature of 16 degrees, which was the temperature at which a particular kind of camellia would consent to bloom. There was a very cold afternoon at the end of May, in which Philippa sat in the small drawing-room, with her father's Cowper on her knee, and read, for the first time, The Task from the beginning to the end. The Duke of Aldwych came again on the 10th of April, on the 5th of May, and on the 22nd of May. He came each time on horseback. He came each time alone. He came each time with something in his hand. On the 10th of April, it was a small folder of the accounts of the North Lot, which he wished her to see for herself. On the 5th of May, it was a copy of the latest volume of Miss Austen, for which she had, without asking, hoped, and which he had, without being told, understood that she had hoped for. On the 22nd of May, it was a sketch of the small dower house made in pencil by the 4th Duke in 1802. which the Dowager Duchess had found in a portfolio in her own room and had asked, in her own hand, to be sent. The letter from the Dowager Duchess, which came with the sketch, said only, "Miss Carr, this was drawn by my late husband. I did not know it had been drawn. I am glad that you have the house. I am well. E.A." Philippa read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the drawer of the writing table with the other letters. There were, by the end of May, 7 letters in the drawer, of which 2 were from the Dowager Duchess, 4 were from the Duke of Aldwych, and 1 was from Mrs. Ainsworth, in which the head cook of Aldwych House reported that Betsy Fleet's brother had, in the interval, been apprenticed to the joiner in the village, and that the arrangement was, so far as Mrs. Ainsworth had been able to learn, entirely to his satisfaction. The letters from the Duke of Aldwych were 4 in number and were each 4 lines in length. They said nothing that would have been improper for a solicitor to write to a client, or for a landlord to write to a tenant, or for a distant cousin to write to a distant cousin at a moderate remove of blood. They were, that is to say, exactly the letters that a duke who had accepted for the interval that he was not to presume was permitted to write. And Philippa Carr, who read each of the 4 letters 5 times, understood, as she was intended to understand, that this was the way in which the Duke of Aldwych had chosen, without having asked her permission, to court her. She did not, in the interval, decide. There is a way in which a woman of 24, in a house of 8 rooms on the western edge of an English park, in the spring of 1815, does not decide, and it is not the way of coquetry or of caprice. It is the way of a woman who has understood that the decision itself is a thing that must be permitted to grow at its own pace, in its own soil, without being watered too often or too little, and who has also understood, in the way she had been trained by her father to understand, that a decision made in the shadow of another person's expectation is not a decision, but a signature. She had signed nothing in the shadow of another person's expectation before. She would not sign this in it now. She waited for the plum to come. She kept the accounts. At the beginning of June, when the Aldwych house at Bruton Street had emptied of its usual company for the country, the season being at that time officially ended, the Dowager Duchess came to Aldwych Park. She came without warning, on a Tuesday afternoon. She came in a chaise. She had, in the chaise with her, 1 small trunk, 1 lady's maid, and sitting opposite her on the second seat, Lady Serena Price. Philippa was in the orchard, in a straw hat with a basket, gathering the first of the small red gooseberries from the bushes along the wall. The terrier was at her feet. Betsy Fleet, who had seen the chaise from the kitchen window and had, with the swiftness of a 19-year-old whose only training in domestic emergency had been the sight of Mrs. Ainsworth's spoon in the copper pan, run to the orchard, arrived at Philippa's side sufficiently ahead of the chaise to give her 3 seconds' notice, and no more. "Miss," she said, out of breath, "Miss, Her Grace, and a young lady." Philippa laid down the basket. She placed the gooseberries in Betsy's hand. She removed her straw hat. She smoothed her cuffs. "Show them in, Betsy," she said, "into the small drawing-room. Tell cook that we shall want tea at 4. Ask her, if she has one, for a jelly."